The man is a painter. Who? The man who lives next door is a painter. See what happened? The information who lives next door helps us know exactly which man I'm talking about. And that, my friend, is a relative clause. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Zoya and I hope you're having a great day full of happiness and joy. Today I want to explain relative clause, give you some examples, and then share some exercises with you guys. Before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more English lessons. Alright, a clause is a group of words that is a part of a sentence. It's not a complete sentence, just a part of it. And the relative clause tells us which person or thing the speaker means. And it often starts with a relative pronouns like which, who, and that. Now we are going to learn two types of relative clauses, defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. First, defining relative clause. It gives us essential information about a noun. As I mentioned, it tells us which person or thing the speaker means. In a relative clause, when we want to talk about a person, we use who. For example, the man who is wearing a black suit is my uncle. The part who is wearing a black suit tells us which man is my uncle. This clause is giving us information that is important and necessary, so it's a defining relative clause. And when we are talking about things, we use which. For example, the house which has a red roof is mine. Which has a red roof is defining relative clause. It's essential information. Without this clause, you don't know which house is mine. When you want to talk about places, use where. For example, this is the city where I was born. Where I was born is defining relative clause. I mean, it's essential information. This is the city what? Where I was born, defining relative clause. Do you want to talk about time? Then use when. For example, the year when we met was special. When we met is defining relative clause. It shows which year I mean. My friends, for possessions, instead of her, his, and their, use whose. For example, I saw a man whose car was stolen. Whose car was stolen is defining relative clause. Actually, his car was stolen. What should we do if we want to talk about reason? Well, of course, we should use why. This is the reason why I left. Why I left is defining relative clause. Please write this important point. Instead of who and which, we can use that. The man that is wearing a black suit is my uncle. The house that has a red roof is mine. You can also use that instead of where, but be careful. Do you remember my example? This is the city where I was born. You can also say, this is the city that I was born in. So, be careful about the prepositions. I add the preposition in to make this sentence correct. But you don't have to use prepositions in all situations. For example, this is the place that we visited last year. One of my students told me a sentence. I traveled with a friend whom I went to Italy with last summer. And then she asked, when do we use whom in a sentence? Listen, guys, in a relative clause, you can use whom instead of who when it's the object of the verb. But nowadays, people use who instead of whom because whom is formal and somewhat old-fashioned. Let me give you an example with whom. Sam is a person whom I admire very much. Here, Sam is the object. I admire Sam very much, so I can use whom. I have a question. Can we use a defining relative clause without who, which, or that? The answer is yes, but there is one condition. We must use who, which, or that when they are the subject of the verb. However, if who, which, or that are the object of the verb, we can omit them in a sentence. Look at the examples. The woman who is there is a doctor. Here, the woman is the subject, so we must use who. But look at another example. The woman who I wanted to see was on holiday. Here, the woman is the object, so we can rewrite this sentence without who or that. The woman I wanted to see was on holiday. Other examples. Where is the cheese that was on the table? Here we use that because it's referring to the subject. But in this example, have you found the shoes that you lost? We can omit that because it's referring to the object. Have you found the shoes you lost? The other type of relative clause is non-defining relative clause. What do you think about it? A non-defining relative clause gives us extra information, not necessary. Let's compare defining and non-defining relative clause. Imagine I have 3 brothers and I say, I called my brother who lives in Norway. Here, who lives in Norway is essential information because I have 3 brothers and I should clarify which brother I mean. This is defining relative clause. And now imagine I have only 1 brother and I say, my brother who lives in Norway is a pilot. Since I have only 1 brother, it's not necessary to clarify which brother I mean. This is extra information and the sentence is correct without this relative clause. This is non-defining relative clause. In non-defining relative clause, the use of who, which, where, and when is the same as defining relative clause. But in non-defining relative clause, we do not use why. Some important points. In non-defining relative clause, use a comma or put it between commas. As I mentioned, my brother who lives in Norway is a pilot. Who lives in Norway between commas. Use no comma in defining relative clause. In defining relative clause, you can use that instead of who and which and where. But in non-defining relative clause, we cannot use that. In defining relative clause, we can omit who, which, or that when they are referring to the subject. But in non-defining relative clause, we cannot omit which and who. Well, we can call it a day. Thanks a ton, my sweet friends, for your attention. Don't forget to do the exercises. I'm waiting for your answers in the comments. Take care. Peace out.